We have plenty of work to do, so we may as well get started. Really quiet. So. All right, so we've got a test coming up in the 4th week. Right? We're currently in the 2nd week. So we've got 2 classes this week, 2 classes next week. A review session on that Monday. Here's how I would recommend you approach the review session. I put questions online that are pretty good examples of the type of questions you'll be asked to answer. And remember, you're going to be here on the nominee 7, leaving there you have to answer 4. And so any preparation you did outside of class will help you use your time more effectively. That's the intention. To give you some insight into the types of questions you're likely to ask. What I've done is I've sat down after class and written out questions that I think are good indications of what was important about that class. And there are 5-part questions. So they tend to, like the one I read this morning, thinking about class today, was about division of labor, much compared to division of labor. What is the division of labor implied by 1 Corinthians chapter 5? You might want to read that if you're going to answer that question. If you have to answer that question, you have choices. But if you want to answer a question on division of labor, that's someplace you might look. It's a corporate answer. Maybe you reject the idea that economists are going to read the Bible and see economics in them. But you can say that. That's a legitimate answer. And then it goes on and says, what's Plato's? Well, we're going to tell you today what Plato's view of division of labor is. We're going to talk about Adam Smith's division of labor. So there are 5 different ways to sort of ask a question about division of labor, asking you to sort of be able to represent different approaches to that. So giving you them in advance helps you, develop a strategy. Now, the downside of this is, you know who you are. You plan to come into the test and wing it because you're pretty smart, and that's worked a lot in the past, right? So this is going to particularly frustrate you, and I'm sorry. Makes the test easier to grade for my part. So it's a little bit more work on the studying, but I think it's a little fairer because you know what's coming. Does that kind of make sense? And the answers will differ. So there's no, hopefully by now you figured out that I'm not looking for a particular answer. I'm looking for a strategy that shows that you understand the different perspectives and reconcile it in some logical way. So you know where you're coming from. You know if you think Plato's the thing. Right? All right, so I just passed out the lecture notes on mercantilism and physics. I'm going to try my best to get into this and cover Mandeville today, but we've got a lot of great thought to go through, and if you have questions, so we should spend time doing that. Remember, this older stuff is really important because other people read it and then it influenced them. So even later, we're going to be bringing up this stuff because we're going to reference that what's going on. So if we want to talk about Greek thought, what we're going to highlight are the things the chapter highlights, which are sufficiency, avoiding excess. Right? So the whole game here has got to be framed in the idea of why did the Greeks think of the world the way they did? And I think it's hard to think about the Greeks without thinking of them as a slave-owning society. That was very hierarchical and adverse to much change. So lots and lots of growth would have undermined the structure of the society. Now, they didn't think that was a problem. You guys might think that's a problem, and that's okay. Right? Non-hierarchical societies are considered a good thing. I would imagine most of you think of that like that, right? But one of the virtues that they claimed is that they kept a sense of virtue and order going after all the good luck, the good things, right? And weren't easily distracted from the right path because they had a system in place that put the right things in focus. Just like a trade and usury, again, corrupts society, moves people off of that path of virtue, undermines the tradition and the identity of that particular place. Poverty can actually be good, right? In the Greek way of thinking. Please don't quote me as Professor Thomas said poverty is great. More people should be in poverty because it's virtuous. I didn't say that. Greeks did, right? What they're saying is, look, idle time can be used in a bunch of different ways. If you're working, right, then so the more Sam is working in manual labor and hard stuff, the less trouble he's getting into. It's an empirical question. So the harder you work, the less trouble you're getting into. So you would actually learn virtue. In fact, progress as an individual this way. And that in the aggregate, the more hard work that it's going to do, much of a slave-owning society is laborers, but very few people at the top. So society is advancing through hard work. This can be really self-congratulatory, right? But don't worry, we're also going to critique wealth, right? What does wealth do? Wealth alienates those that are wealthy. In fact, you can become wealthy enough to not really be human anymore. You're so detached from society, right? So, lose your connection to what it's like to be a member of society. We're also going to talk about the division of labor. I'll highlight this because I've already told you one of the questions likely to be on the test is a comparison of division of labor. Which one's different part because it's just a major thing. Right? And then limited trade, right, with other qualities specifically to preserve the identity of the existing set of principles of virtue. All right. So when I talked about things in the New Testament, I said, look, the New Testament has to be different than the Old Testament because it's prudence and something. Okay? Here's my best shot at explaining what the and something is. All right. So if we generalize the pagan virtues, now we're in a Catholic college, so it's a way to divide up people, right? Pagan is the stuff that's before or prior to Christian, and then the Christian virtues. So what's the difference between these two lists? Anybody have any ideas? What strikes you as a major difference between them?
Faith.
Faith? Okay. There's faith in there.
The ones on the left seem more likely to extend credit.
Extend credit? All right, so if you have those things, you'd be more willing to lend money to people that aspire to these virtues.
The left seems a little bit more social, while right is a bit more individualistic.
Yeah, so justice is ambiguous here, right? Because it's hard to think of justice as purely individual. But yeah, the other three seem pretty clear individual virtues, right? So temperance, prudence, courage, those are things we can locate squarely. They might be present in a group, but they tend to be individual virtues. So I think that's right. So faith requires some notion of group belonging and solidarity with some principles. Hope is an extension of that, sort of forward-facing, future-facing. And charity, remember, caritas is a complicated word to translate into English. It's love, but it's like having a proper relationship with others, having an orientation to others. It's not sympathy per se. There's meaningful distinctions, but it's a difficult word to render in English. For those of you that have spent time thinking about charity. So prudence, courage, temperance, and justice are considered the pagan virtues. So if you get these right, these are sort of how I'll call them the rules of the game, right? You do these things and you get them right, you understand economics, you understand law, you understand politics, you get all this stuff right. The the thing that we're trying to describe about the New Testament of Christianity, it's going to have some reference to that. That's my best case for making a prudence and timing and distinguishing the Greeks from this. Now, this means that within the Greek worldview, we're going to be looking at economics in a slightly different way because we're not adding the and in entirely. Right? So it's a good place to go to try to reconstruct what's going on outside of those considerations. All right, so I said hierarchy. What do I mean by hierarchy? Well, this is the best picture I can find of like an urn relief with slaves and some stuff on it. But slavery is really important. And what I want to emphasize is just the hierarchical structure. So the head of the city is just sort of the best among the heads of household. And every household has other related men, dependents, other related dependent women, dependent children, slaves that work for that household. And then you can think of all around society are non-citizens, which have no status. They're visiting, they're interlopers, they're sojourners, who use the Mosaic word. So, slavery is sort of has a legal status for someone else's property, as opposed to just being a visitor from outside of that group, which we have no status. All right, so these are the sort of hierarchical things. Now, when I try to explain what they were thinking, like I'm trying to recreate the justifications that they had. So, as you move up this hierarchy, right, it helps to be a man. It's just the ancient world. But then among men, you can exhibit virtues. So we have to have an example of virtue. Even the word virtue is just manliness, right? So these are loaded terms. But Pericles is a great example because he's just the classic example of virtue. What I claim here is that prudence, temperance, courage, and justice are things that he's all argued to have held together at the same time. And what we might call that is magnanimity, sort of greatness of soul. Okay? So the union of virtues has a name, to the extent that this is the name for it, magnanimity. And sort of being good at all, combining all of the different virtues. So the virtue of a leader then has to be magnanimity. And that's the search. The whole system is designed to find people that adequately represent the virtues of society and put them in charge so that they can make decisions. If you're really good at managing your estate, then you'd be good at deciding things for the estate. So one of the questions we ask in economics is where does value come from? Well, in this system, value comes from people who have demonstrated success in sort of management of a household. They get to be in charge of more stuff. But it's limited because the city is pretty much limited. All right. So what we want to talk about here is the division of labor and where it crops up the first times in Greek thought. So if society is like a house, literally the economy, right, like the management of the household. If we're trying to make the analogy of a house, we go straight to Xenophon. So if you're good at managing a house, you can manage other things like cities. Now I have these two pictures up here because I want to talk about if you're trying to understand the division of labor at the very first level, if you're trying to come up with this without your apparatus of economics and all this kind of stuff, where are you going to go? Well, let's think about shoes, shoemakers versus people that build a house. You need both. Are people going to get better if they make a lot of shoes? Yeah, specialization, right? Do you want somebody building a house that's done it before? You don't want to just build a house for yourself. You want to benefit from having other people that have experience. So you start recognizing these things. But let's just take the shoe example. Like how many shoes are worth one house? A lot, right? This is a fairly small unit. This is a fairly large unit. So in an economy, one of the questions is how do you compare across units? And the fear that Aristotle had, which keeps coming up, we'll come back to it with Marx, but the fear that keeps coming up is that if I make a shoe for Sam, just me making a shoe for him, we're going to do it like they do in Portugal, right? I'm going to measure his foot, I'm going to make some cuts on some leather, I'm going to get everything I need from him, I'm sitting away for a couple of weeks, and I'm going to make a shoe, he's going to come back and it's going to fit like a glove, right? You can still buy shoes in Portugal like this when I go to Portugal. Gobblers. So Aristotle said there was something relational, something fundamentally human about our interaction of me measuring his foot and making him a shoe that fit his foot. And I don't mean to like make you uncomfortable or anything, but the shoes that you have on are like half sizes at best, right? So you can get kind of close, but you're used to wearing shoes that weren't made for you without reference to your foot. Anyone bought something online by like pressing into a mold and sending it back on the internet? That happened. That is a thing. Right? Has anybody done it? Best you can hope for is like the British side, really old ones. shoes as being an inventory, something that's just made as a shoe in general, Aristotle emphasized that this was the first step away from an economy of personal interactions to an economy of, well, what Marx would call commodities, right? Of sort of these things that were not directly made for human beings. It was alienating. It broke down the connections between people. I was no longer making shoes for people. I was making shoes so that I could have a whole pile of shoes, keep them in inventory, and there's wealth there in a way, but what is it worth if no one's using them? I'm counting on the future value. I'm spending all my time over specializing in shoes in order to make profit there. And then I get these questions of like, how do I change my pile of shoes into a house? What negotiations and what contracts and everything am I taking on to do that? So it's the first version of economics. And the concerns there are that it's fundamentally changing social interaction. It's drawing people apart. They're thinking each other instrumentally, because I now no longer think of Sam as a foot that I need to dress well, and I now think of him as a customer who just has money that I need to somehow get from him. Does that make sense? It's changing the social relationship through economics. Okay, so I have we got a Hesiod, we have an explanation of why work is good. We're all fallen. People are bad, otherwise we wouldn't be here. Life is hard. If we work really, really hard, we can get a little better, we develop good habits. It's never going to be really simple. Some of us claw our way out of the mud enough to have some moderate luxury. But the default is bad. So if you believe this, it then makes sense as you're going to and from each other's houses, and you see a lot of laborers out, like really working hard. Yeah, it's natural. What do you expect? There's literally just not enough resources to go around. Everybody gets to live in luxury. Does that kind of make sense? So we've rationalized now the world as we see it and said, well, who gets to be in the mansion? Who gets to be at the top of society? And the way that we describe this is through a political theory where people have developed virtue, right? And before you dismiss this completely, think about how important this is to the way we even talk about these things today. Liberal arts, what does it mean to be liberal? Free, right? Liberty. Free. And we refer to this as sort of a freedom of mind. You can learn enough that you're independent in your own thought. You've seen different arguments, and you've come to your own conclusions about them. Right? That's what we mean by liberal. But the opposite of this was servile arts. So these two categories sort of reflect a structure of society that's very Greek in origin. So we have to think about it, right? Have you earned the right to liberty because you've developed your mind? Because you've developed human capital, if you want to use a particular phrase. Do you earn that right through the work, sort of developing the virtues and disciplines of someone who's a free thinker? And then that justifies your place in society. And then without that, the natural state of man is just living in the muck. And so it's no responsibility of yours to make people work harder and put themselves out. So it's pulling up out of book Bootstraps and stuff like that. This has really old origins in the way that we think about the world. So when I say that we're inheritors of an Athenian worldview, this is just an example of how that thinking comes through. Does that make sense? I don't want to belabor the point. I just want to accurately try to build the old worldview so we can see what the alternative is as we look at economics, right? So I find these early economic ideas to be, philosophically conservative. They're interested in maintaining order. They're interested in locking down much change. And they're considering all of those things as inherited depositories of virtue. Right? So I just want to flag these things. All right, Democritus is going to push back on wealth. right? So this is one of my favorite stories. George Bush is sitting there at a convention of supermarkets, like technology, right? So you can imagine it's 1992. So they got these new scanners. They're like battery charged, and they walk around and they can kind of keep inventory, and you can put things on the shelf and count as you go, which was new and cool and nice. But he didn't look at any of those. What really fascinated George Bush in 1992 was this machine where you could scan barcodes and it would ring up all the prices. It was the old way, that he remembered, was that you kept a list of everything you bought and you set the prices and summed it, right? On a ticket, a handwritten ticket, right? So that's the way people used to do it, right? The problem is that somebody took a picture of this because they thought it was really interesting, because scanners were first introduced nationwide in 1976. Right? So this was just evidence Bush had not been to a grocery store since 1976, at least. Right? Which means that he's somewhat out of touch with society. Does that make sense? Do you want to vote for someone who hasn't been to the grocery store in a decade and a half or more? Do they understand your problems, right? Like there's ways people do this with every candidate, right? So, when's the last time they drove a car on their own, right? People like to say that not driving. So are they really relatable? Well, no, there's a certain point of, well, now, that's a cute, like, we like making fun of politicians and everything. I asked in the last class, and if you'll permit me, I'll ask here, you don't have to answer. How many people have ridden the bus in Omaha? You don't have to, you can do one of these things, I'll count you. Okay, so more than the last class, it's slightly bigger class, so I think you're even proportionately more people in this class. But this, it's similar, right? Not very many people. Now, why is that, right? Is it, somebody said, well, have you ridden the bus, or it's kind of dirty? It's not, when I go to Europe, I ride the bus, it's really nice and clean. Right? But Chicago? Buses in Chicago? All right? But maybe that's not it, right? Maybe it's that there's a sort of stigma associated with riding the bus, right? And so what Democritus would really emphasize is that if your wealth, if your rank in society according to wealth, changes the very nature of your experience, something is seriously wrong with society. All right? If there are two classes and some go to grocery stores and others don't, that's a serious difference in society. And that's just evidence that the society is corrupt. So what you've done then is you've set up a whole class of people that have wealth that are completely alienated from what a normal person would experience. If you don't like the bus analogy, because I like that because it's easy to kind of think about healthcare. Right? When you get sick, you go to the doctor. When you go to the doctor, do you expect to get a prescription that you'll actually fill? If you do, you're probably in a minority of very well-off people. Okay? So if your entire orientation to the medical system is different depending on where you are in the socioeconomic order, Democritus would have a problem with that society. Wealth has alienated you from the problems that normal people face. All right. So that's a strong antecedent for any of your conversations about inequality. All right, so Plato has a puzzler, a mind experiment. In a completely equal society, would there be a division of labor? His answer is yes, but the puzzle is why. Right? We've all got stories about how people get better at certain things through repetition and practice, but if we assume that way, if we assume everyone is equal, would we still have division of labor? Like in the strict Ricardian sense, right, of the reason we trade is because we take advantage of different opportunity costs, we'd say, no, I wouldn't trade because I have exactly the same opportunity cost as the same person. So why does Plato say yes?
Because if, maybe as an individual you don't benefit any more or less, but as a society or as a group, you benefit.
Yeah. Yeah, somebody in the last class came up with an example, well, somebody's got to dig potatoes and then somebody else has to build a boat. And to do equal work on both of those things seems kind of crazy because that's a lot of potatoes up around the board. And just the movement between those places eliminates some of the gains from trade, right? So that's a good way to think about it. So the way that I like to think about it, that I think is useful to remember, is imagine you had 100 people who were all just music virtuosos. Anybody play more than one instrument? Okay. Imagine you've got 100 people who can play every instrument in an orchestra. Wow. But it still makes sense to sit them in different chairs and have them play different instruments at a particular time. Okay, right? In order to have an orchestra, you have to have everybody play. Somebody's going to play the violin, somebody's going to play the cello. You even have to have non-string instruments. To have an orchestra, you have. Right? So you divide everybody up. Even if everybody was equal, it would still make sense in concert, right? In orchestra, is an analogy for the economy, to have people sitting in different spots playing different instruments, because the whole then comes together in some way. So then, from this recognition of the division of labor in the ideal state where everybody is something utopia where everything is equal, he then says currency would actually be necessary to reconcile sort of ratios between trade and things like that. So it would be necessary. But the problem then is, as we adapt this to the real world, those types of trades start to introduce corruption, right? And the reason it would do that is because, look, in the real world where we have differences, right, once we start introducing differences, we rank those differences. Somebody's going to end up with the thing that they specialize in that's not considered valuable, and somebody's going to be specializing in the thing we consider valuable. And that introduces sort of ranking and difference.
So you're saying, like, say you have like a teacher, like an AI that takes care of every music production, and humans are basically left there otherwise just do whatever we want and create a state, right? Well, even that would still develop our own in-groups and out-groups, and then we build a hierarchy based on that, irrespective of what we produce as a result of these
Right. So in the ideal republic, I don't think we'd have a hierarchy, right? So if we're moving out of utopia, we're moving to the real world when we start introducing distinctions based on hierarchy.
Yeah.
So every step outside of this utopia is a step towards sort of these distinguishing things that create hierarchy.
But even if everything's equal, even if there's no system to denote that our artists are better than our musicians, right? But even so, they may engage in some competition. They may say, let's combine our pursuits and try to make it bigger than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, so it's hard to conceptualize, right? So let's go back to the orchestra example. So if we can do it in that, we can probably. Okay, so at some point we're going to say the violinists are all going to get together and say we're the best instrument. The cello is going to figure that out, even though it's not clear.
Exactly. It's just because we like it. Yeah, exactly.
I think that's
Yeah, that's what they are.
So you start introducing these things, and that produces the corruption. Produces the sort of, I keep thinking of words that other people use. Right? So
Yeah.
trying to get that thought example. Right. The other thing here is trade with other groups, because if you've got the right way of life, if you're a Athenian, that's the best thing going. Trade then can only bring you down to the extent that you adopt other practices. Anything different is a reduction.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could elaborate more on why trade is used as corruption and not necessarily as like how modern economics might see it as like, oh, different prices actually signal like that some things are in higher demand, so we should focus on those. And that seems like less corrupted and more efficient in all actuality. That like
Yeah, but so efficiency requires a standard of measurement. So necessarily implies, and this is probably a side conversation, but efficiency necessarily implies the picking of an objective standard. So not everybody agrees about the standard. And so if Plato's right, any change would be not efficiency, because he's already efficient. So change, if you're at the pinnacle of what you do, efficiency given the proper things to consider, any addition of other vectors to consider is a reduction of efficiency. Logic. So the idea that there's a diversity of different ideas out there, we can switch and we can do different things, and whatever the market bears, all this stuff is totally different than what Plato did. It's the right sort of comparison. All right, so the idea of wealth growth, what we really want to hit here is that if you're managing the state, in an agricultural society, there's a certain way in which wealth grows. Right? You grow your cattle, you grow your farm. If we allow you to get on a ship in bad weather or bad season, it's not bad weather, and go across the sea and sell all your goods at twice the price, you've now doubled your return on your investment relative to what everyone else has done. Right? Now you've grown at a rate that is much, much higher than the standard rate of growth. And that itself is intrinsically suspect. The important part of this example is to distinguish our modern sense of what it means to arbitrage from the difference between the type of wealth accumulation arbitrage is versus the type of accumulation that growing an estate, like agricultural investments you can make on your own estate. So merchants are offering a separate way of accumulating resources, and it's through sort of taking advantage of conditions as they are to arbitrage. And they're getting wealthy much quicker. You don't have to be a pharmaceutical dealer with some marketing, some technique, or Shirley. I can't say it, so yeah, you guys all know what I'm talking about. You don't have to be a jerk on top of taking advantage of people, right? It's just that rate of growth intrinsically raises red flag. The fact that someone gets wealthy. It means that the very fact that they're getting wealthy at that rate shows that they're corrupt. Because it's not the same as someone who's a good, upstanding member of society that runs their household well. This is the kind of person that doesn't run their household, gets on a boat and takes things across the Mediterranean or somewhere else to sell it for much higher rates of profit.
Is it kind of about risk? Like the person who does
They don't have a risk in any developed sense, right? So they don't have this financial calculation, this idea that, in fact, when we get, in a couple of minutes when we're in the late Middle Ages, they're just discovering risk. Right? They're just figuring out what it is. So,
is this kind of more like a proxy for risk then?
oh no, they don't
Is it
approximate it. They just
it's
think it's bad, right? I mean, think about it. So Jim is going to go get on a boat and be gone for 6 months. Somebody else is going to run his household. He's going to come back with a lot of specie, whatever we value, and he's going to be very wealthy. You stayed at home, took care of your family, and you grew at what was a nice 10% increase over the next year. You worked your butt off. He comes back with double as well, because he knew something about demand in another Greek island, and knew what would be kind of dear. He arbitraged. You did the right thing, he did the wrong thing, he got really wealthy, and something's really weird about this whole accumulation of wealth. And he came back with like a pierced ear or something like they're there on that island, and he's no longer a thing. Right? It's this really deep sort of concern over the stability of the culture that's being manifested even in the critiques of the trade, right? So we can exchange, right? Even Plato says there's exchange in this ideal utopian world where there's none of these other risks. It's just opening the door for a lot of problems. So it has to be constrained, it has to be limited. We can grow, we can get wealthy, but we mistrust wealth is growing at too fast a rate. And if you're sitting around, even in the Middle Ages, reading things that are inspired by the Greeks, reading about these ideas, this is your general sense, right? wealth in itself is corrupt. Alright, another reason, or another way to put this thing, is that if all you're thinking about is your bottom line, and if all you think about is what salary you're getting, and whether or not it's bigger than someone else's salary, this is extremely self-referential. And if you're going to learn anything, or you're going to grow or expand or be aware of other ways of doing things, right, you have to kind of be around other people and have relationships. So to the extent that wealth itself motivates people to think about themselves, motivates them to be self-referential, motivates them to think about their bank account instead of their sort of status in society, then it's isolating, alienating, or self-referential. So epistemic closure is a fancy way of saying it. I'm only concerned about myself. I no longer have to think much about family. Another way of thinking about this is, if I run a Wendy's, how do you know if it's a good Wendy's? Makes money. So as long as people keep coming back, I'm doing something, right? Doing something well. But I no longer have to refer to other ways of thinking about it, that I run a good Wendy's and I care for my customers and
Would anyone say that like the more shoes you make, the more virtuous you are, or the more houses you make, the more virtuous you are?
to the extent that it's labor, right? Then it's gotta be, at least you're not doing something else. Alright, so now we're gonna jump to the high scholastic period. We're gonna worry about usury, just price, and cost. Just to point out usury, like modern critiques of usury come in through things like the payday loans. Everybody wanna like just claim payday loans are pretty good, it's banking but unbanked.
The Obama administration was highly opposed to them, I think, right?
Certainly during that time period, we had a lot of articles written about, I haven't thought of anything in particular
Okay.
related to a particular administration. People generally don't like them because they charge really high rates of interest. We call these usury rates of interest. Now, I remind you that any interest was usury for most of human history. Right? So how would I do this, right? So how would I get a loan? Or how would I get money for a project? Well, I'd go to somebody that's fairly well off. And they would let me use the money. I would owe them the money back, but then I'd also owe them kind of a favor or something. It doesn't have to be a Godfather type of scenario. So then you would owe somebody something. Clientela is what the Romans call it. System of favors. And you can't really understand clientela if you don't, like, it's trying to do this sort of accounting but through relationships rather than through finance. So if Sam owed me something, I could get a favor from Jem by giving up my favor on Sam. So if you needed something from him, like you're in the class, I can put something for you by trading a favor, and you can turn the favor in. And get Sam to give you a bill for the class. So this type of, I don't know if you would call it shadow market or something like that, but this type of accounting that's outside of interest has to come into play if you don't have the explicit financial market. But the reason that you do this is just the same reason people object to payday loans. People get into it, they start paying a lot of interest, they have to borrow to pay off the interest and the principal, and it just keeps getting out of control, and they get sucked in, and then they basically are wiped out. Lose everything they got. So if that's going on, then that's a bad practice. So it's either a form of banking for people that are about to lose their apartment because they haven't paid rent, or it's something that's getting people involved in a long sequence of events that's always ending in being bankrupt. This just happens to be from Merchant Venice, showing just a picture of one version of it. Somebody mentioned that earlier. Just price, you guys all know about just price, right? We talked about minimum wage, we talked about rent control, we also talked about fair trade coffee. What's the basic idea here? Well, we're thinking about how to apply justice, and we're trying to make sure that people aren't being taken advantage of systematically. All right, so selling your labor for a very low price is bad. That's something we're really interested in. It's something we're paying a lot of attention to. But you can also think about when people are selling necessities, right? So if people are selling grain, which is a large part of everyone's diet at this time, are they bound, because it's a necessity, to sell it at something that's sort of the average market price? Doesn't really matter about the conditions or anything like that. But you can't really profit, you can't arbitrage, you can't benefit from the fact that people are really hungry and sell grain at a higher price. Or, what do you do if you're one of these merchants, right? So remember, at this time, port cities, it's easier to get to other port cities than it is to the interior of your own country. So transportation by water is a lot easier than transportation by land. So if I take a risk and I go to another country and I sell a whole bunch of goods and I make a lot of money, what do I do when I get back? Well, I've made a lot of money, so I go to the priest and confess, because I think I earned so much that it's got to be a sin, right? If you stay afterwards, I'll tell you my favorite Jesuit joke. Of course not. Right? And so I go to my priest and I go to confession, and he got to decide. How does he decide how many Hail Marys I'm supposed to say, or whether I actually have to do a pilgrimage or something with that much money? What's the proper penance for this? Well, it turns out that a bunch of Dominican and Jesuit priests got together and wrote up all of the different penalties that they've been prescribing, put it in books and circulated it, and came up with a whole theory about how many different types of penance you could do. It was called casuistry. And it's early economics. That's where economics comes from. And it's sort of pre-modern science. So coming up with just price is not just a sort of abstract idea of what is the proper just price. It comes from this confessional. It comes from trying to articulate how bad is this relative to this, right? And so what you would do is you'd say, look, when I went across to another port, I took a risk. Shouldn't I get compensated for the risk? And they're like, oh yeah. So that's at least 10 Hail Marys less, because people benefited from you taking the risk. So we don't want to penalize that. But you still have to make sure it's money, so you do this, right? And so getting this proportionality of all the different offenses prescribed started the conversation about economics. But you can see why that would come up with early ideas of equal government and things like that. All right. Cost theory value is really trying to spell this out in greater detail. So, how much did you buy the stuff for? How much did you sell the stuff for? How much does it normally sell? What's the difference? Are you allowed to have that difference? Yeah, I took a long trip. I had to, every port city has a market fair at different points during the year. I had to wait until there was another market fair in the city where I wanted to sell this. So I held the stuff for 3 months. That was a cost. I took a risk transporting it by ocean. That's a cost. So I started articulating this. If I accumulate all these costs, then I can justify a certain amount of profit. And then the rest is the extravagant. So that's one way to justify profit. How else can we justify profit? Well, if I'm extremely charitable when I make a bunch of profit, that gets me off the hook for a lot of stuff. Right? So I can be wealthy as long as some proportion of my wealth is spent in charity. So I always think of the Medici building all these sculptures and all these wonderful paintings and putting together art schools and stuff like that. So their version of the story is this justified all the wealth that they created, right? You could have a large family, so you need more wealth in order to have a large family. And you could also be in an industry that is particularly crucial to the survival of your country, either through military or just as one major industry in that country. And then that's sort of all of your goods are made in the service of the nation. So you're allowed to keep this profit for reward. You're a good person, you're subscribing to the values that your society holds, and therefore your profit is justified. So you can imagine there are ways to sort of rationalize profits here. So if you start thinking about this emerging growth of trade in Europe in the late Scholastic period, you can also, at a similar time, you've got Protestants. So now we're starting to develop theories about how growth comes from all of this activity. So we're going back to older ideas of prudence that we talked about in the Old Testament. So with Calvin and Luther and all these folks, we've got ideas that, well, maybe we are rewarded for doing such things that are good in this lifetime. Right? Maybe usury is not just any interest. Maybe usury, because interest is necessary in order to facilitate commerce. And people are getting better off. So maybe we should just put a cap on interest. Interest can be tolerated only up to a certain point. We're going to evaluate the claim that capitalism sort of grew out of Protestantism generally. And so the history is Northern Europe was both capitalist and Protestant. So are those causal? One of the most famous theories that launched sort of institutional or sort of institutional descriptions of economic history was Max Weber's thesis that there was a Protestant work ethic that led to huge amounts of growth. So, think about that for a second. Okay. So, the focus on prudence, one of the things I just want to underscore and point out is that a focus on prudence, a focus on sort of wealth as meritocracies, people being rewarded in this life for wealth, gives you an alternative to the hierarchical view. Right? So I don't want to push you in any direction here. I want you to think about these different perspectives. But the hierarchical perspective argued for the virtue, for holding virtues, for having order, for being principled, trying to balance out all of the things that ought to be done in society. The wealth getting, or the prudential viewpoint, that prudence is reflected in your gains in this lifetime, in your wealth in this lifetime, reflects an alternative to a hierarchical or centrally hegemonic or monocentric sort of view of society. If you did well, you were reflecting hard work and sort of some basic understanding of society and what made people better off. Just like in the Old Testament, we talked about kings that acted according to God's rules, did well, individuals that acted according to God's rules did well. And this particular type there. Now, I want to contrast this, right? So I'm trying to give you some other ways to think about the Protestant work ethic theory of Max Weber. So the best place to go there is just monasteries, right? We just happen to be in one, so that's something to think about. But what's the basic idea of a monastery? Okay, I'm going to go to war. And I do a lot of despicable things. But that's okay if I can pay me to pray for me for 20 years. I'm only going to do about 20 years worth of bad things. If he spends the entire time praying for me, maybe I'll get out of purgatory. So I go and make a lot of wealth, all the gain, spoils of war, all that kind of stuff. And as long as he sat back at home and prayed for me the entire time, maybe it cancels out. So monasteries grow because a lot of people want to go engage in war and all kind of other kind of stuff, and they won't be able to pray for them. It's a very simple story, right? Oversimplified. The problem is once the monastery gets wealthy, then they start doing other things. Start making wine, start making beer, start doing all other kind of stuff. And then they don't want to just get money so they're not praying, they want to do other stuff. There's better economy. Well, so that order's done, you gotta go on to the next order. So you're gonna found a new order where they really focus on praying again. That's what I really want to donate to. Once they get land, right, which perpetuates its own wealth and growth and all that kind of stuff, then you gotta get a new monastery in town. So if you look throughout Europe, there's just all these different monasteries that keep cropping up, different orders, to try to address this basic problem. Well, they were pretty successful, they created a lot of wealth in the area. One of the reasons that Wondershare was really popular is because anyone that fell along with his view of theology could confiscate the lands of the monasteries in their local area, which in Germany was about, I think, 30% of the land in Germany was somehow accounted for by the Catholic Church. So what I'm saying here is that the economic model of the monastic corporation, which I think it's safe to call it that, was actually really successful for a long period of time prior to any Protestant Reformation. So it complicates the story. Max Weber is generally considered to have an interesting institutional analysis that didn't benefit from a lot of historical evidence, because there wasn't much writing on it, etc. So good for him that he came up with an interesting idea and background that ended up playing out quite the way that he said it. Alright, so there's Max Weber, since I have a picture of him. Alright, so that gets us through where I wanted to get for discussing. We did the Old Testament, we did the New Testament. Today we did Greek and the Scholastic and the early Christian. Questions? So we're going to switch to mercantilists and physiocrats. I think we can get through Mandeville. What do I want to say about Mandeville? If you really want to know more about what I think about Mandeville, there was a snow day a couple of years ago. I had a makeup session. I recorded it. Not everybody could be there. And that's my lecture on Mandeville. So it's online. It's linked to on Blue Line. So if you really, if you're one of these people that really likes markets and wants to talk about the orders, free markets and stuff like that, Mandeville's a great starting point. It's used influential for a lot of those times. So I suggest just go look at it. All right. So Mandeville is one of two important positions that we're going to talk about. I'll call them positions. I think today we would call them internists in internal medicine. They're interested in the whole body from a sort of system perspective. So it's no surprise that Mandeville and Francois Guisne looked at the economy through several lenses of thinking of the natural analogy or the economy as a body. So on first, when we talk about physiocrats, we'll talk about Guisne, but we're also going to talk about Mandeville. So Mandeville specialized in disorders of the gut, of the stomach, and his theory was if you have a balance in the gut, with a whole bunch of different things that all worked against each other and came up with balance. So that theory gave him a starting point. Now, I don't know if you guys eat man and over or probiotics or all that stuff. That's basically what he was imagining. He didn't have any of the details because they didn't have microscopes and microbiology and all that kind of stuff. But he was speculating in this way. It's not like humors that balancing. That was the older version. He was actually pretty forward looking. He also pioneered psychotherapy. Right? So he thought that if people sat around and talked about their problems, it would help balance. Psyche was part of it. All right, so there was this strong idea of harmony. So what did he hate? Well, he hated ideas of public virtue. Right? He thought that one of the best things that happened was that we got rid of this sort of hegemonic or monocentric idea of virtue. And getting rid of that allowed society to grow. In fact, his analogy was a natural analogy. He said, look, if you look at society in a way, it's like a giant beehive. Everybody lives in the cities and they go about doing all this other kind of stuff. And if you were to put virtue back in, the economy would shrink. And his analogy is the beehive would shrink all the way back into the size of a hollow tree. Just like the natural state of bees, in nature, that man had somehow broken free of the natural constraints and created an economy primarily because it gave up on the idea of public or aggregate virtue. And so, how do I get you to understand exactly what he meant by that? So my analogy, I used this in the last class, and somebody who lived right next to Yellowstone, trying to mess with the detail. But there's a book called Playing God in Yellowstone. And since I don't live in Montana, I'm convinced by the thesis. You can make your own mind. Anybody from Montana? Alright, so I'll try to give the best description as possible. Wolves were taken out of Yellowstone. Right? They were a threat to local cattle ranchers. The wolves were sort of culled, cut down. Ranchers were tolerated killing a bunch of them. So the wolf population was virtually eliminated from Yellowstone. As you would expect, the antelope grew. The size of the herd grew. Right? The problem with a very, very large herd of antelope is they start going down, eating willow bark and everything, and pretty much going anywhere they want because they don't have to watch out for wolves anymore. So they destroyed the banks of the river, cut down the willow bark, cut down a bunch of the trees that were growing, and the beavers could no longer get the trees to build the dams and do all that stuff. They flood meadows and do all that kind of stuff. Right, so apparently this had a big impact on the fish stock as well. Right, so the whole idea of this is one small intervention that was supposedly good. How horrible is it for wolves to run around and kill antelope? Let's get rid of them. And honestly, we're a threat to adjacent cattle ranchers. Right? They're eating cattle. So another reason to get rid of them. So you get rid of the wolves, the antelope will thrive. But the antelope don't thrive because the overall ecosystem is upset to the point where even the antelope started having problems. The herds were too large, they were starving to death, overgrazing, things like that. Right? So that's the theory. And then the wolves were introduced back in and it put balance back into the system. This is perfect Mandevillean logic, that there's some sort of balance in order. Right? It's not that it's free of intervention, that's not possible. But there's a natural balance. Things that are bad check each other. So wolves check overgrowth of antelopes where they overgraze and starve to death. So it's kind of a choice. Do you let them get eaten by wolves periodically, or do you let them starve to death through overpopulation? That's the Mandevillean sort of law. Okay? So let's do another example. It's not about Yellowstone. Let's talk about marijuana. Should we have zero marijuana in the United States? Right? Even if it's bad, let's agree. Let's all just decide to agree that personal consumption of marijuana is bad for you. It's not a virtue. Let's just stipulate. Would it be good then to eliminate marijuana completely from society? Right? How would you do it? Do the ways of doing that cause more problems than the marijuana caused? That's a Mandevillean sort of question. How much law enforcement do we want to impose into the economy to stop marijuana smoking because we think marijuana is bad? Even if we all stipulate that we agree that smoking marijuana is bad, at what point does the additional resource of law enforcement in the economy start doing more damage than the removal of harm? Does that make sense? So there's a natural balance here. Right? Maybe law enforcement's always going to go after people that have too much marijuana or honest, but there's some sort of balance. And looking at the world through a Mandevillean lens would say, don't try to get zero. Let's figure out what the optimal level is. Let's try to figure out what the balance is. But the idea that we're going to somehow place zero marijuana in the public virtue realm. Kind of strange. All right. I think those examples kind of get us started, but you can see how Mandeville would be non-interventionist. So his particular target are people at the time that have a whole bunch of religious notions and trying to eliminate them. His target was brothels, I think. He said, look, people want to get rid of brothels and tax them out of existence, or just make it illegal to have prostitution and stuff. And he said, if you do that, that's going to create all kind of problems. This is a reflection of something about human nature. So maybe you don't go along with Mandeville on that, I don't know, but the idea is that every social problem is just a manifestation of human nature in balance in some way, being acted upon by a whole bunch of things that if you change those conditions, will just produce other vices. And if you start imposing virtue across the spectrum, what you're going to do is just eliminate all of the potential growth in the economy by eliminating every sort of trade, because every trade is objectionable in some way. This is the mirror opposite of what we just did with liberties. Right? Saying that in fact, having these ideas of public virtue are the thing that reduces economic activity. He's kind of silent. We'll talk about it when we get down to Smith. Mandeville is extremely silent with regards to where then private virtue comes from. And Smith really despises him for this. I don't think he rules it out. His principal virtue is justice. He says, vice is beneficial found where it's by justice lived in better. That's on your sheet, so I think I got that right. Vice is beneficial found where it's by justice lived in better. So then the real game with Mandeville is to figure out what he means by justice. Right? Is it contract enforcement? Is it property rights? Is it rule of law? Like, how do you want to articulate justice to fit your Mandevillean system? But it's the first time that someone's articulating a minimal kind of state that just keeps justice going and then leaves all other considerations outside of the public sphere in order to get growth. So that's Mandeville in a nutshell. All right, we have a couple of presentations. You guys can just kind of stand up and talk about your stuff. All right, let's go.
Right here.
You can come up here if you want.
Absolutely.
Why not?
So for the next 90 seconds, I'll be presenting on Pierre Groningen article from 1983. The main point of the article is to discuss an 18th century economist named Turgot, who for 5 years was one of the leaders in econ, even though his tenure was short because he ended up doing other things in the ministry. He was one of the first people to introduce the concept of diminishing marginal returns, and originally he was considered to be part of the French physiocrat school, but he expanded their model by saying that not everyone's a hunter-gatherer and that there is a production class that doesn't directly influence it. So he also was a really big proponent of laissez-faire and that having government intervention disrupted costs. So the main article, or the main point of the article says this guy was really influential, and if you look at the article, I think he makes a really good point because he brings up very specific instances where a bunch of economists a century later, such as Karl Menger, Thomas Malthus, etc., cite him very frequently. The French liberalism school is directly based off of Turgot's works. Liberty is the #1 issue there, and I think it ties directly to the course because one of the main proponents from Turgot is this idea of liberty, that you really shouldn't mess with trade, and that trade is even one of the best ways to promote regulation, and that ties into the course because we've had discussions with the Greeks on does trade corrupt a society, how much does it benefit versus how much it costs and who can you do it with, so that is the argument.
That's a really important thing to emphasize, right? So coming out of Greece, you get the idea that order is really important, although you don't like all the stuff that comes with that, like slavery. So it really emphasizes that in order to reverse that, give some other perspective, what the Fingercrafts were doing was trying to come to another orienting principle.
Yes.